Hi, I'm Chappington, and welcome back to Skrælige. This is chapter 12. We'll be talking about early Canadian Skrælige. So after some shuffling around, the government of Skrælige reported to the so-called Governor of the Canadas, and that's why we refer to this time period as Canadian Skrælige, even though the modern nation of Canada wasn't really a thing at this point. It was all separate provinces. After the Revolutionary War and the influx of loyalists, the new thing had to represent and govern for groups of people who weren't necessarily inclined to get along. There were no formal political parties yet, but the Thingmen loosely organized into three main factions. So there were the Patriots, who were the pro-American faction. They were still upset over the earlier privateer raids. These were mostly comprised of New Englanders, the people who had settled mostly in the 18th century from the continent rather than from Europe. Next, there were the Loyalists, also known as the Tories. They were the faction most loyal to the British Crown. Their base of power was in the recent white Loyalist immigrants, but also included some of the more conservative Old Skræligans. And then finally, there was the Liberty, or the Frelsey faction, basically more moderate patriots with cross-language support. They were in favor of remaining subject to the British Crown, but otherwise advocated for their own autonomy. The majority were Old Skræligans, but a significant number of New Englanders were in this group as well. And there was significant conflict between the Loyalists and the Patriots, as well as some of the Libertarians, as they were also known. Part of this was provoked by conflicting land claims. Most Loyalists, at least the white ones, were granted land throughout the country, with a significant focus on the upper Sigwon Valley. Black Loyalists were granted land, but this was generally inferior farming land in remote areas of Skrælige. In the haste to assign these plots, some of them overlapped with land that was already settled. It's the classic British thing to draw lines on a map and kind of forget what's already there. So many of the people that were already there, though, were patriots. They weren't in active rebellion, but they still held some animosity towards the Loyalists, and now here they are stealing their land. Some of them were able to come to compromises, but based on how outnumbered they were, most of the settlers that were there before were forced to accept smaller land grants in more remote areas. Despite being outnumbered so heavily, 20 of these settlers decided to stay and fight, and this sparked the Patriots' Rebellion of 1786. It's a small rebellion that had to be put down by the British Army. It was completely unsuccessful at preserving their land, but it did serve as a rallying call for the Patriots, and it inflamed the lingering sectarianism in Skrælige. This violence would pop up every so often, occasionally small riots or just conflicts between people, and this conflict pervaded the politics of the era. Among the Loyalists that fled to Skrælige were some doctors involved with hospitals on the continent. A group of them, led by William Lloyd, established a new teaching hospital in 1787 just to the south of the capital, Skrælingborough General Hospital. The hospital began with two goals: to treat the poor, as the wealthy could afford to be treated at home, and to train more doctors and surgeons. Skrælingborough General Hospital, later also known as Skrælingborough Almenna Sykehus, was also the predecessor institution to the University of Skrælige, later also known as Skrælig Islands. The medical school would eventually expand to create its own undergraduate school in 1828 and expand its research into other scientific fields. Here we're putting the hospital district together with the hospital right on the outskirts of Skrælingborough. I'm using this, the building looks very European, but I think you can stretch it and it still fits in here for the time period. You can also see there I was messing with the fertility resource because I like to try to use some of the gameplay elements, even if it is infinite money and everything unlocked. And then replacing all the default trees here. Throughout the whole time playing City Skylines, there's always been a slightly different mod to do this. So it just changes every patch, it seems, or every other patch. But here we're starting to try to plan some roads and figure out what the best layout is for this kind of odd trapezoid. I'm starting to use some of these farms, I think made by Evermetry. Filling in some of the buildings here, just enough to set the context of what's going on. We'll be adding a lot more buildings later. And here's the results. While this was going on, the original sections of the Thormo plan in Skrælingborough were just about filled up. And so new plans were drawn for a new outer ring of sections. There were going to be 5 larger districts, and they'd each have a larger central square. So they wouldn't have quite the same tight-knit communities around small communal spaces, but there would be more open space for the people. In clockwise order, the new sections were named Thormo Village, for Thormo Goddesson, the member of the Thing who designed the original Thormo plan, as Georgeville, named for the various King Georges of Great Britain, and the Hospital District, which is where Skrælingborough General Hospital was built, New Hanover, named for Hanover, the current royal house of Britain and the part of Germany where they're from, and Lower Port, or Nederhofen, which is just further down the river from the main port. The plan was drawn up in 1788, which was not quite in time for development of the city to spill over the old boundary, but not so late that it was impossible to organize the rest of the city's growth. So now we're adding some more industry. These are the Charles Street, what do you call them? I guess like Charles Street manufacturing, Charles Street factories. Anyway, the 19th century New England industrial buildings. It's kind of exactly perfect for what we need right now. Maybe a little bit more modern. And we're trying to finagle this into a coastline that's, well, it's the shore of the river, but it's like a bit of a cliff. There's definitely a height difference there, and if we want to have it so that it's also accessible to boats, that's a difference we have to deal with. Though kind of dealing with those height differences is tricky, but is also part of the fun. And then I'm using the Skrælig colonial houses again. This is probably getting to the end of where they make sense to use. This was mainly for the 17th and 18th centuries, but can still get away with reusing them now, where we're introducing some more variety of architectural styles. And then I also keep building during the night, which, when I'm playing, looks fine, but it's probably a little trickier to see. Get to actually copy some whole blocks here. So yeah, this starts to get very repetitive, and at this point, all the buildings look very similar. Over time, this will definitely get better. There's a new synagogue in there, which I didn't really mention in the article, but it's there. Then we have to give every square a well there so that people can actually get drinking water. There's no like municipal water supply yet. That is coming though. here we're getting to kind of the weird connection, because we've had two squares and the trapezoid for the hospital district, but now I'm just trying to figure out like what we put in the middle so that it still looks kind of cohesive. Inside each section we try to have rectangular blocks, but still have it fit together somehow. But I think we settle on a shape here that gets, I don't know, like a diamond that bulges out a little bit. That's the best way I can describe it. But it does let us put some good rectangles in there that fit in with the rest of the sections. And then now, kind of like, we've got the center, so now trying to figure out how to connect it with the other sections. So there's a few different iterations of that, as you'll see. Just adding in a few more roads to give us a final road layout. And that's where we'll stop this part of the time lapse. And Skrælige really did continue to grow. There are a couple of reorganizations of towns that had to happen. In 1792, the land of Abenakibara was split into two. It was West Abenakibara and South Eaglestead. West Abenakibara was the original settlement, and it was then merged into Middleton to create one larger town. And then South Eaglestead was actually a new village. It was mostly just some farmland and otherwise undeveloped. And this is mostly land grants that had gone to loyalist refugees. This was continuing the consolidation of smaller towns in the Skrælingborough metropolitan area. And instead of haphazardly commissioning censuses, as they had done previously, the Thing instituted a decennial census with the Census Reform Act of 1799. Given that Skrælige was showing no signs of slowing down its growth, these regular censuses would be critical to keeping track of the colony and maintaining representative government. In 1800, the census counted 25,364 people in all of Skrælige. In 1810, it was all the way up to 33,294. As part of the Census Reform Act, each Thinga, that's the different representative districts, would have to have the number of seats adjusted to the new population, rounded to the closest 1,000. As part of this reapportionment, the districts could be split or merged or otherwise reshuffled, the only requirement being that they not split towns into multiple districts. So, for example, this led to the Ragnarsson and Northstead district splitting into its component towns, Ragnarsson and Northstead, but it meant that Skrælingborough would have to stay as one district, even as in 1810 it had 10 thingmen for the district, which made the elections kind of complicated. Once the census was completed, the reapportionment and the subsequent general election would be required to be held within 1 year of the census. Combined with the 4-year maximum assembly length, this meant that there would be at least 3 elections per decade. It could be more. It was a parliamentary system, so elections could be called early. Meanwhile, though, the relationship between the new United States and Great Britain, it had began somewhat peacefully, but began to deteriorate in the beginning of the 19th century. The Napoleonic Wars were being fought in Europe and across the world, which disrupted trade worldwide as well. Both Britain and France attempted to force blockades on one another, banning neutral vessels, including the United States, from trading with the enemy. Hundreds of American ships were seized by both sides for violating these blockades. Another major grievance the United States had with the United Kingdom was impressment. The United States Merchant Marine had been expanding, and lured British sailors with better pay and conditions, but the expanding Royal Navy had labour shortages of its own. So it turned to impressment or the forcible recruitment to fill that shortage, not just kidnapping people on its own shores, because that's basically what impressment was. That's just a euphemism for kidnapping people. But they also impressed sailors on the seas. And American ships made great targets for this because of the British sailors that had been recruited by the merchant marine. This also meant that an unknown number of Americans were caught up. They weren't too concerned with the specifics of nationality law. The concept of British versus American nationality was pretty complicated as well. Britain didn't allow anyone to renounce their citizenship, even if the US considered some of these sailors to be American citizens. So under the rules of impressment that the British had, they would consider it perfectly legal. With these grievances, in combination with other factors, such as there were some people in Congress that wanted to annex Canada, and others that, while they didn't outright want to annex Canada, they wouldn't say no. This was going on during all the westward expansion as well. The United States just wanted more and more and more land. So with all those factors, the US declared war against the United Kingdom in June of 1812, which began the War of 1812 and once again put Skrælige against the states that were just across the Skræligan Sea. That covers all the history for Chapter 12, but there is a lot of build footage. So I tried to piece it together into something where you can see how this was all built. Hopefully it's not too repetitive. I've kind of spliced it together so that even though chronologically in my time I was going back and forth between a few different places, I'll at least try to keep this consistent. So right now we're working in Newhope and Fort Charles and that area, but generally just try to keep it to one or two nearby towns at a time. So one of the interesting things here is because what I really need to do is go into the life cycle rebalanced mod, I think it is, and make it so that people don't use cars as much. Because until recently, I'd been getting away with having all the hand carts being like vehicles that they get in. But for some reason, Fort Charles counts as like a really popular tourist attraction. So you have a bunch of these cars, which are really just people carrying carts, all converging on Fort Charles. So in order to relieve the traffic congestion, I added a second bridge here. I'm not sure if it necessarily makes sense historically wise, but I think it looks fine. And with that and some traffic manager or traffic president shenanigans, this ends up being a pretty useful bypass. Doesn't completely solve the traffic congestion. That's going to take buses, which are being worked on, or will be. I've got the model mostly done. And then finally expanding this little the little village of Stefnabjörg. That's, if you saw any of the earlier Skrælige videos, that's where the initial landing met the native Abenaki, and that was kind of the meeting rock where they met. Then we're filling in the shipyard a little here. Just trying to expand this industrial area. So I'm trying to keep up with the various demands here. And so when they demand industry, I add on to the industrial areas we have. And then add some housing right nearby. So like the town of Newhope is merging towards the Fort Charles shipyard area. And then we'll end with the time lapse of how the area changed over the 3 decades, roughly. And then we have this little village. It's the Vinstrileið village. I mean, technically there was already one further down that's like super tiny, but the gist of it is like this is the Vinstrileið, or it's just like the left road, back when Skrælingborough was Skrælingborough and much smaller, and it had a road to the left of the church and a road to the right of the church, and so this is the left of the church road. So we're adding a little village here. This is kind of where the terrain transitions from mostly flat to a slope, and then it goes up to Copperstein. I've got some, let's call them funicular plans, potentially. Let's see if I can make a cargo funicular work. We'll see. But that'll be just like a rail-based, but not steam-based transportation system. This village is right at the point where you would have to transfer cargo. So, possible future plan. Pretty sure I'm going to try to get it to work. We'll see. I'm using some of these. I forget who made these, but the like historical American houses. And up until now, they've been a little too modern, but I think they're starting to work now. I'm still mixing them in with the Skrælig colonials. We have Northstead here, just the other side of the Sigmund River from Skrælingborough. And then we're seeing here how, because I designed the Skrælig colonial houses to be wall-to-wall and kind of fit in like at least increments of half tiles, even at slightly funny angles, they work pretty well for building blocks. Though sometimes the space in the middle of the blocks is a bit too big, so I kind of add these random streets and put some footpaths in for connectivity. And then here, one of the more like, it's like called traditional ways of expanding is just going like following the lines of the farm fields. And so then in the future, it's like, well, the farms are all gone, but the street pattern still kind of follows where they were because it was like kind of just purchased like that. So most of the towns besides like Havant and Skrælingborough kind of just follow that, like farm field by farm field. Those are the only two towns that really have a solid plan. And then the other thing is like, I was kind of looking at census data for nearby places. Surprisingly hard to find some of the Canadian like population estimates around this time, whereas the American census was happening since the start. So by this point we already have, I think 1790 was the first one. But the point is, we've got a lot of good population data for how big Boston is and for how big Massachusetts is, but not quite as much at this time for like, I was trying to get like what's New Brunswick or Halifax or in Nova Scotia. I was trying to get that sort of data. That was a lot trickier. So I've kind of just figured out like, okay, what's the population of each town that I'm kind of aiming for? And so there'd be new successive waves of me adding on blocks in Northstead. It's kind of like, okay, well, build some blocks, let it fill up, see what the population is. I've got the realistic population mod, so it should be close enough to 1-to-1. And then eventually it gets close enough where I figure, okay, this is done enough for this update. The population is close enough. And then some of these main roads start getting upgraded to be cobblestone roads. I have a lot of have some fun with the node controller just to shrink down a lot of these roads, because the buildings aren't going anywhere. And I've been saving a lot more than is probably realistic, but it looks nice, so. But resizing the roads at least lets me squeeze in the road and the sidewalks. Then here we have the time lapse of how Northstead grew. So next up we have, well, both Havant and Middleton, because Havant is just across the river and they actually have a bridge connecting each other, so that kind of is going to merge into just one urban area. So continuing the Havant grid here gets a little tricky because, well, the main road curves and the river gets in the way, but we're still kind of following the spirit of like this rigid square block system. Relatively small blocks too. Kind of like Portland, Oregon, I think would be the better way to describe it, at least the philosophy of it. But with the other thing with like the census counts and kind of figuring out what the growth is like and figuring out the target for Havant, kind of ran into the opposite problem of Northstead, where in Northstead I was trying to get the number up to a certain point and just keep expanding until I get close to that number. For Havant, it was that I wanted to get the development in the middle and the development at the end of the bridge to kind of merge together. But as I kept doing it, the population got pretty high and was going to go higher than I wanted it to. So you'll see as we build, the buildings get closer, but the built-up area doesn't quite touch. And it also means that like some of the prime land is still little farms. But this area will definitely develop a bit more in the coming decades. The other part of Havant's development here is adding a waterfront industrial area, because again there's high industrial demand, which is probably not quite accurate for this early in the 19th century, but so kind of try to fit in some industrial buildings there. And then wrapping this section up, Middleton also gets this extra industrial shoreline here. also gonna start busting down some of the old walls without any real conflict with the natives to worry about. A lot of these walls have outlived their usefulness, and so some fragments of the walls are going to remain just for nostalgia. Historic preservation isn't that much of a thing, but some parts will remain. And then there's little before-after shots. So finally, we're doing some more work on Skrælingborough. We've already put together the street grid, but now there's filling in more buildings, again, to kind of reach the population we're targeting for 1812. And then there's probably more buildings that should get knocked down, but I have a historical reason to take care of that coming later. But we're at least knocking down some of the buildings in the center, updating them with some of the New England townhouses. Those kind of urban buildings that totally fit in here. They look more modern than the Skrælige colonials. And then also this is the old cemetery that was supposed to be emptied out earlier, but a lot of local opposition meant that that process was a lot slower. But now the marketplace is starting to take over some of that land, and soon it'll be mostly gone. But right now it's just eating into it just a little bit at a time. And then some more of the towers on the walls are going away, and we're going to end up saving one or two of those, but a lot of them are just going away because you can't fit that much traffic through that little gate. And we have to keep expanding the cemetery, that necropolis out here. And then here, just trying to get this, work with the terrain and get this industrial shoreline going on. Cut out a few of my earlier attempts to figuring out which keys or which, trying to use terraforming networks. I'm trying to figure out the best way to go about this. Eventually I kind of go with the tried and true, using a network wall and then the cobblestone surface objects. And now the challenge is getting these mill buildings in a way that, like, I don't know what the technical term is, but like where on one side you enter on one floor, but then on the other side you're like down a floor or two. So we're kind of trying to set up something like that. Though I guess at this point we have an intermission where I'm starting to fill in more of the blocks. And we're diverging from the previous planned Skrælige colonial houses, and just there's some industrial housing with the brick buildings there. So we're introducing some new architectural styles that make the outer sections look a bit different, add some variety. The plan isn't quite holding together as strictly as it used to. And then here we have the interesting setup where the nice square angles and streets inside the section meet the reality of the outside roads that define the edges. So kind of figuring out the best way to put a square peg in a round hole, so to speak. Then a lot of the time I'm just scrolling through all the buildings that I have and see which ones might actually fit the time period, which ones don't fit yet, which ones might be too old. And then there's these King Leno ones, and especially like this, like the campus housing DLC as well. Well, not technically it's DLC, but like builder creator packs or whatever they call them. And they will really fit in well in a few more decades. But right now they're a little bit too new, I think. They fit in best, more than a few decades. I think that they'll probably fit in best in like turn of the century sort of deal. I've ended up skipping over a lot of the house filling in, kind of just show the pattern of how it works and put some of the more interesting designs there. But now that Skrælingborough is expanding so quickly, there's a lot of repetition, and it's probably not that interesting to watch. So hope you don't mind the executive decision I made to not include everything. Also seeing some of them, when one of the latest patches came out, the mod I was using to stop some of the problems with like not having water, that seemed to stop working, so now I've just spammed a bunch of water block services, and that seems to do the trick. And then there's more of these New England townhouses that we can assemble. They mostly line up, but the corner ones don't quite fit together. Some of them like have gaps for like driveways, which isn't quite so applicable here, but it kind of works. And then trying to see like how I can set up fences for backyards in a way that looks still kind of works for the era. I'm not 100% sold on how this looks, but it's better than just the empty yards, I think. Yeah, so now we're fitting in these walls behind the keys, and then we're going to put some ploppable surfaces behind them. The weird thing is that Move It was, I don't know if this is normal or just it acting up, but what would happen is I would set up my line, and they're all at different heights, and then set the height so that they all level off, but then when I move it slightly, they'd all pop back to the original heights, which was kind of confusing, but managed to get everything to work eventually. And then this area probably deserves more detail than I gave it, but I did start adding these stairs. And then later on, as this riverside industry develops more, I'll give it some more detail, add some more props, that sort of thing. There's definitely like not like a real detailed budget, but there's a certain amount of time you can spend on details in one area, because if you spend too long in that one area, then you're never going to actually get all the expansion that you want to do. And so it is a compromise between detailing every area and just getting the city done. Alright, so here's where I actually start putting together the separate entrance floor deal, where on the city side, looks like you come in on like the third floor, or second if you're European, and then the bottom there you come in on the ground floor, on the river side. That part of the river shore though isn't quite as developed yet. That'll be coming later. And I kind of skipped here, just filling some farms in the empty blocks. There's been enough farmland in this series, I don't need to show it every single time. So I'll just wrap up with a couple more blocks filled in with New England townhouses. We get the final before and after shots. That's chapter 12 of Skrælige. Thanks for your patience. I am getting this out before 2023. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.